Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I would say about 90% of my guests are not they're not strangers to doing podcasts, but I'm actually more experienced than most of them because I host the podcast while they're just guests on podcasts. Every now and then you run into somebody who also has their own podcast, which is fine. There are a lot of podcasts out there. Let 1,000 podcasts bloom, yada, yada, yada. But rarely do we have someone on here who is in podcast years what I am to internet years, a Methuselah, someone from the before times, from the Pleistocene, where Titans roamed the earth. And I'm talking, of course, of a peach of a guy, and that's what his last name means, Peach, Mike Pesca, who I believe is like the longest running normie podcaster in the English speaking language. Do I have that correct?
You have that correct. I want to compliment your vulnerability, to do a podcast with a veteran when you were but a neophyte.
Yes.
I am Methuselah-like. I also have a vestigial tail. Yeah, so the gist has been going on for, we're in our 11th year, and I say it's the longest news and analysis podcast. There are things that you could listen to on podcasts that were radio shows, that's news and analysis, that are longer. But as every day, that's the other thing, daily news analysis. Every day I'm going to talk about the news. I'm going to bring you an interview. I don't think anyone's been doing this as long as I have or has the vestigial tail to show for it.
Yeah, because I think Russ Roberts' Econ Talk podcast, which is a different creature, is older. But
yes,
and
there are interview podcasts, but how I distinguish the gist is it really is a show. So I like a long interview, like say a remnant of earlier times, if you will. But I have a show. I introduce the show. Then we do an interview for 20 minutes, which I record for 30 minutes to a half hour. And we chop down because I have an NPR background and things always get better if you take 10 minutes out, I think. Take the worst 10 minutes out of everything, including, your life. Think about how many car accidents could have been avoided or just how many ums and ahs or false starts could have been avoided. And then at the end, I have a spiel, which is essentially an op-ed. So it's a show. Yes.
All right. Fair enough. Yeah. Now it's like, I was a blogger before we had the word blogging. So the G-File started at NRO in 1998. So, and one of the first pieces I ever wrote before I went to National Review was for Slate, which is where you used to be. And I knew all those guys prior to you getting there. I was buddies with a bunch of those guys because we shared office space in Washington with the DC people. So
yes, Plotz always talks about this. David Plotz. Yes. He's like, Jonah. Right when the Lewinsky scandal broke, he was like, and I just walked down the hall and talked to Jonah.
That's right. And Frank Foer and all those guys. So anyway, enough of this old home week. I have a different philosophy about podcasting insofar as this entire conversation would probably cut from your podcast before its lack of utility and edification for the mass public. But I am transparent to my listeners, including for my rambling. So you are in Chicago.
I am.
You are covering the convention.
I was in the streets yesterday, Jonah. The streets.
And what is in the streets?
Far fewer people than were promised.
Really?
I don't know. I don't understand the philosophy of the protesters. Well, I understand they want to hype their importance, but they know that eventually rubber and road do meet. So when they were saying 40,000 people are going to show up and they get a tenth of that, it's a bit underwhelming or massively underwhelming. Also, they guarantee, I don't know, maybe it's a ploy to divert police resources or something, but they guarantee that they'll not be able to create the chaos that most of them, so this is what I saw. Most of them are the literal peaceful protesters that MSNBC will always tell you about. But there are enough of them who aren't, and there is an interplay between the people who have the just call off your bombs and let's have a peace deal. All we need is a peace deal is for the bombing to stop. And so if you ask them, well, what about the hostages to be released? They haven't thought out that part. But the kind of earnest peaceniks and I don't know if they're Antifa, I don't know if they identify as such, but people who really do want violence and the violent agitating people get in there and try to guilt the other people and say, let's go for it. We're blocks away from the United Center. We're If we really care about these people, we'd be going there. And they convinced some people, but not enough. And maybe if there were 40,000, there'd be enough to breach more security gates and create more havoc. So that's what I'm seeing. Massive police overrepresentation, underrepresentation by protesters. So, though some, if not havoc, some chaos and attention-seeking behavior has been successful.
All right, so I want to ask you this because, like, I don't like crowds, and I kind of don't like protests even when I agree with them. There's just the aesthetics of all that is just not my thing.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not of the protesting ilk, if you will.
Yeah.
I've engaged in one ever. Yes.
But what, like, when I see people block people from getting to the airport, right, in solidarity with Gaza, I see it as wildly counterproductive. When I see people trying to throw soup or paint on paintings in museums, wildly counterproductive. Have you run into anybody who has a plausible theory of the case about how these tantrums actually truly, like, can connect the dots on how they actually help their cause?
Right. Aren't we going to glue our way into a better tomorrow?
Exactly.
How could you let all those old masters have frames without human hands being glued to them? So how?
I mean, you mentioned the chairman of the board, the board of trust, the board of, like, ExxonMobil coming, being saying, like, all right, we got to shut it all down. A bunch of people glued their faces to some paintings. I mean, that's just like, I don't get it. Right? So I don't get how you get from A to B on that stuff. But anyway, go ahead.
That's right. It's like, well, we did tap the North Slope, but not even the actual painting at the gallery in London, but these are copies of paintings. Anyway, so there was this great scene where delegates to the convention are being made to wait online for 45 minutes at a time. Now, this is you were at the RNC, right? Mm-hmm. This is in contrast to the RNC, which, hey, you have your credential, come right in. And I think the reason for that is they're so cognizant of someone sneaking in a Palestinian flag or banner, which did happen day one briefly, that they're really searching everything and everyone. You could also say, well, the Secret Service has shown a disinclination to search very hard when Trump's safety is at stake. Not so with Kamala Harris. I would not think that that's the main explanation. But you have this dynamic where delegates, important people, I don't know that senators have to wait on this line, but certainly elected officials and important people are waiting on a line for 45 minutes, and the public can walk right up to them. So there was this scene where there were right around the line of delegates, which was a 45-minute wait. So they have unmitigated access to them. There was a line of pro-Palestinian protesters, also some drug legalization guys. It worked, fellas. You could go home. So a line of pro-Palestinian protesters, and they were holding signs and talking to the delegates, and some of the delegates would talk to them. One of the delegates went up to a Palestinian protester and essentially said, and I have this on tape, I'm with you, but there's only so much we could do. And you would see from a protester's perspective, this is working. On the other side of the line, there was a guy in a baklava or balaclava. He was wearing a Greek dessert, and a mask, and he had a pot and a pan, or maybe just a pot and a spoon, and was screaming at the delegates, blood on your hands. Where are you with us swearing on this show?
Go. We'll bleep a little, but we're not going to don't let
you
it
can imagine.
Fly.
Go.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So he was having no such compunction. So what I did was I asked the one guy who was this. He was a very kind soul, and I think wrong on the issues, but you could see why a person of his ilk would, just want the bombs to stop. I'm like, doesn't that other guy ruin your cause? And he expressed, you can see that they don't have enough either critical thinking or backbone to say, yeah, he does. He really does. There is just nothing within the movement, nothing among the soft sides of the why can't we just get along, or why can't we express our thought, or the DNC should really consider their immoral actions. There's nothing among them to say, and you bastards are hurting our cause so much. I talked to so many people who you would maybe see as your daughter's misguided friend, or just whatever a protester is. And not one of them would say, I wish they wouldn't do it. Now, maybe they were talking to me, and I'm not, I just tell them I'm with the gist, and they might know what that is or might not. So maybe, there's a little Heidegger is the experiment affecting the experimenter. But I really do think they don't have it within them like other causes like other protest groups do, where they said, you extremists are hurting our overall message, and therefore the extremists will always get their way and be able to thrive within their ecosystem.
Yeah, because I just find it like the media doesn't, I mean, all the usual caveats, you know, media is a big term, lots of things, many rooms in the mansion of the media. But like my daughter was going to school on the West Coast, and there was a big pro-Palestinian, some parts of it might be pro-Hamas, depending on your point of view, whatever, protest thing. And a lot of my friends who have college-age kids have told me the same, you know, had similar conversations where, not Columbia, right? Columbia's a special case. But like at most of these schools, they're like, oh yeah, that thing that's going on over there, right? And they don't bother with it. They don't go there. It's like, if you're not inclined to go to it, you probably think they're kind of dorks and you don't care about it, right? Or whatever. But if you would watch the cable news coverage, you watch the nightly news coverage, if you shoot anything close up enough, it looks huge, you know?
Right, right.
And like, there's this impression that the protest people, and you saw it in the coverage from the convention too. And you see that every, I mean, I've been to a lot of conventions. I'm not in Chicago for this one. And the cameras go where the action is, and they try to find the craziest people possible. But I'm not sure that actually conveys, I'm not sure it's a public service to give them the attention that they're seeking.
I don't think it's a public service even for their cause, you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
Both ways, right? I
Right,
don't think I don't think it helps their cause, and I also don't think it necessarily, you know, we have so much nut picking in our culture, where in our politics, where you take the example of the worst people on the other side, like the guy who said he's entirely pro Hamas and pro October 7. I've seen clips of that guy being interviewed on Fox and a bunch of other places. I would like to think that he's not entirely representative of the protesters.
Right.
But he's interesting. And
right.
I could see, if my mom were still around, she would say, see, that's what they're all like. And actually, I could see John Bedard saying that too. But my point is that, you know, like, you know, I used to know a cameraman when I was a television producer, and his rule in network television, particularly local affiliate news, was the 3 T's, tits, tots, and tears. And like
I hope not all at once, though. That is
preferably not all. Yeah, but that's what you wanted in your B-roll, right? That's what you wanted, and like I get it, but I'm just not sure it's all that helpful to the American public about informing them.
Well, how it really has an effect. You're right. It's not helpful in informing them, but then that dynamic, even that small percentage that gets the attention, becomes the actual, not just the story, but becomes the reality. First of all, you know, extremists ride that wave, and there are many members of Congress, but for the cameras focusing on other extremists, would never have thought to run, would never have had a groundswell of support behind them. But I think the Democrats are so terrified of anything, any banner unfurled for more than 5 seconds. We're so terrified of any disruption for their perfect coming out party for Kamala Harris that it very much played into their pick of vice president. We'll never be able to prove this. They maybe don't even know this on a conscious level or a non-whispered level. But I definitely think that if it came down to anything close between Shapiro and Walz, they were like, you know, Shapiro is going to engender 10 more unfurled banners, that much more of a chance that we're going to have an imperfect convention. And I really think that came into play. So who's driving that decision? Democrat fear, the perception of what the media will do to elevate the message of a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction. But it has an effect. So then the guy banging on the pots and pans saying you got blood on your hands, he gets validated. He's going to keep doing that. There are no disincentives to doing that. And of course, the, you know, apocryphal, all that is needed for evil to triumph is good people to say nothing. And that's going on. That's the dynamic going on your daughter's college campus. Like, they might say, if polled, hey, what do you think of the goals of these protesters? I think they'd be much less popular than outsiders would think a college campus would hold them in popularity.
Well, and also like this thing where you were describing about how you would talk to the decent, good protester, right? Standard protester.
Right.
And they would not condemn the jackasses, right? That, I think, is going back to the 1960s, one of the central dynamics of the Democratic Party, which is now being incorporated as part of the Republican Party, which is, you can call it popular frontism, or you can just call it like, love me, love my whack job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where like you cannot have like the classic sort of mainstream liberal intellectual in the 1960s and 70s could not bring themselves to condemn like the Weather Underground people or the Black Panthers and all those kinds of people, because at least they were authentic, right?
Right.
They were, and all that kind of stuff. And it's this cult of action kind of thing. You now get that, a lot of that on the Republican side. And I very much want centrists to condemn whack jobs. And I think the Democratic Party would be in much better shape as a party if the people who disagreed with the people to their far left said so. Just said so. And instead you have to have this sort of fake comedy and kumbaya stuff, which allows people from the outside to say, oh, see, they really are all like Ilhan Omar because they won't condemn her, or they all are like Rashida Tlaib or whoever, or they all are like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Lauren Boebert. And,
Right.
you know, go after your whack jobs, you know, like pick fights. I just, it bothers me that how little of that we see in our politics these days.
Well, I mean, this goes back, I'm sure, way before Goebbels, but it is very useful for any movement to have an outermost flank that you could point to say, listen, it's not me, it's these nut jobs. And we come in this time of such the cliche of the Overton window. I mean, in the last 10 years, the Overton window was ascribed, every bad idea beyond, I'll say this, the worst ideas are contained in the phrase thought experiment, and the second worst ideas are contained in the phrase the Overton window. The Overton window gets
I got a third one
for
for you. I don't think you'll disagree with me. Just asking questions.
Well, sometimes the thing is, I ask questions, and sometimes I really am just asking questions. And just asking questions, I would put in the both sidesism, where it's like, yeah, there is a lot of terrible propaganda that gets excused as both sidesism, but I want to hear both sides, not on every issue.
I'm with you, but you know what I mean, right? Like when you're asking questions, it's because you're just being curious.
Yes,
I'm just asking questions thing is a cowardly dodge where look, I don't think that many Jews could have been killed, but look, I'm just asking questions, right? That's the context I mean it. Anyway,
no,
go on.
I know you do, but people knowing that context and having decided that is true, and Milo Yiannopoulos is quote unquote just asking questions, or take whatever radical just asking questions asker you want to pick, Noam Chomsky. Then when I really am asking questions, I am accused of, you're just asking questions. So it all becomes this meaningless mush. But yeah, anyway, I was saying Overton window, the radicals serve a purpose for the centrists or the moderates who really do want change. They'll never condemn them. I think that the dynamic of, I think it's probably true with the Republicans, but with the Democrats, there is just enough an honest to goodness opposition to funding Israel that many politicians know, look, there's 20% of the party that really does not want one more dollar to go to Israel, 25%. And with that much of the party there, there's going to be politicians who take advantage of it, who speak to that base. And many a Democratic politician will say, well, we can't just castigate them because they really are part of our base. I was asking some of the protesters, I'd say, hey, you're from Chicago. They're not. They're from some surrounding Midwestern state. So did you go to the RNC? No, none of them went to the RNC. And we were at the RNC. There was almost no protest. I'm like, so why are you why didn't you protest the RNC? They must have all the things that you're accusing Genocide Joe or, potential genocide Kamala of doing. The RNC incorporates that in spade. And the answer would always be, well, blather, blather, blather. We know we can't change their minds. We know we can't guilt them into acquiescing to any of our agenda. So there's no point. So therefore, I said to them, so don't you think, just in terms of game theory, what the Democrats should do is say, if they're wildly opposed to your presence because of the 100 people I saw pass you online to engage with you, if they're wildly opposed to their presence, wouldn't game theory dictate they take an RNC stance, just flat out say, we're not listening to these people? And the answer was always no, because 25% or some inflated percent of their constituency has to listen to us. And I think they're right about that. There's enough people in the Democratic Party who fundamentally agree with their the most reasonable, non-hand glued to a painting version of their ask.
All right, so I have a question for you. I'm merely asking a question.
That's the thing. You know what? It's merely and only asking questions. If we can reclaim that and change the adverb, I'm pointedly asking questions. I'm conspicuously asking questions.
That's right.
We could save that. Yeah.
Sincerely asking questions.
Yes.
Look, it's tangent, but it kind of reminds me. One of my favorite things is to stumble on literal uses of common figurative phrases. And I'll give you an example since you're a sports guy. Years ago, I was at the Laurel racetrack with some buddies and was asking my friend Doug, who are you going to bet on like the third race? And he says, I like this Edgar Prado guy, but I got to check his track record. And I was like, oh, we used it in context.
That's where it comes from. Interesting.
Yeah. And I was on a boat recently and I got to check out, I was like in the captain's wheelhouse. And I was like, I'm in his wheelhouse. But
so
anyway,
if you talk to a tailor and he lies to you, can you get mad because he really was just making it up out of whole cloth? I mean, that is what you pay him to do. Now,
that's right.
Does that mean the suit fits? No, but that's what tailors do.
So
was he supposed to tailor his answer to your wants and needs?
Right. So I am literally, not figuratively, just asking a question.
Okay.
So look, I think there's anti-Semitism on the left, right? I mean, I know, and I'm not asking you to speak for the left. You're like a centrist kind of guy and all that kind of stuff. But you talk to a lot of these people. You travel on their waters and whatnot, and you have opinions. You're allowed to have opinions. I think there's real anti-Semitism out there. And then there is what I would argue is structural anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And the argument I would make is that if you take the good faith argument for the existence of structural racism, right, where it comes from originally through critical legal studies and all that kind of stuff, the formulation is that because the reason they came up with concepts of institutional racism and structural racism is the lawyers could no longer find evidence of deliberate bigotry.
Right.
But they still had these desperate outcomes. And they said, okay, so here's what it is that there are institutional rules and arrangements, customs,
right,
that sometimes unknowingly are perpetuated that have disparate outcomes, right?
Right.
And
it's not that the banker hates you because you're black. It's that he defaults to his algorithm and it says, we can't give you the loan. And guess
the
what?
algorithm has a thing about intergenerational wealth or what zip code you live in and all these kinds of things. And, and so it's a barrier to entry that has disparate impact, right? So if you take that logic, right, and leave intention out of it for 2 seconds, I don't think it's disputable that the United Nations is institutionally anti-Semitic, because
they also happen to be interpersally anti-Semitic in many cases. Yes,
I'm trying to put the people who are legitimately anti-Semitic to a side.
Yeah.
But when you look at the numbers, and if anybody's interested in this, just go to UN Watch and they have it all broken down. The number of condemnations of Israel versus any other country is sometimes 20-fold, 30-fold, right? It's crazy how much it's done. When Muslims kill Muslims, Syria, we just saw the Rohingya just had another horrible slaughter, right? Very little is said, very little condemnation. The standard by which Israel is judged versus, say, Putin is judged, right? If you talk about if you want to talk about genocide and occupation, I'll see your Gaza with, Tibet and the Uyghurs, right? You can go down a long list. And if you use the logic of structural bigotry, the fact that Israel is the only Jewish country in the world starts to sort of stand out. Now, the question I have for you is A, do you disagree with that? And B, how much of the problems that the Democratic Party has with Israel sort of stem from that problem, right? That it's a spotlight that's put on Israel, and so it is it's like the drunk looking for his car keys where the light is good, right? Or is it just simply that Israel's our ally and therefore we hold it to a different standard? Where do you think it comes from?
I think a lot of it is what you put your finger on. I think that absolutely goes on, and it's important. I would also add to the litanies of horrors in the world that get ignored. And we're talking, I don't say this just to blame the United Nations, when so much inaccuracy is spent on the horrors of Gaza. Of course, it's horrible when that innocent people are killed, and at a very high level. And whose fault is that? You and I would both say, but okay. And I think you and I would probably both say there are a couple of instances, certainly, where Israel has dropped a bomb that was probably too big to do the job, or it didn't do the job. Fine. But when I read official UN declarations and decrees and just the stuff put out by their press office, and it describes the slaughter in Gaza as the fastest or the quickest death toll in the 20th or 21st century, the late 21st century, I just say, you're the United Nations. Do you know the Effacer les Tableaux, which is when in Congo, 90,000 pygmies were killed in like 3 months? So you're just, to borrow a phrase popular in those circles, you're just erasing the experience of other people actually slaughtered, and you're the ones who we have tasked with preventing this slaughter. So it galls me, and not as a whataboutism, but by pointing a finger at Israel in a way that you don't anyone else, you are clearly showing an unwillingness or an incapacity to do your job and to remember and try to police the slaughters of all innocent people. I think that the structural anti-Semitism is true, but it's very hard to get people to see that because there are many Jewish protesters there. The history of anti-Zionism is filled with extremely earnest Jewish people, including Herzl from the beginning, who didn't exactly think that there should be a country, or if they did, they didn't think that country should be Israel, right? One of the most famous members of the Warsaw Ghetto who fought and killed Nazis and survived. He stayed in Poland, one of the few Jews, because he was an anti-Zionist. So I will say there is a category of cannot possibly be anti-Semitic, but you are also anti-Zionist. But what anti-Zionism has become, and it's so clear to see, is a get out of anti-Semitism free card. Hey, we know not to say anti-Semitism, we in the West, we on college campuses, we know not to say you Jews like they do in Hamas's charter. We'll just say you Zionists. And you get 90% of the effect by lambasting Zionists. And so that's why I think the Democratic Party, who probably does share a lot of the worldview of being against settler colonialism, many people in the Democratic Party feel that way. They probably say to themselves, unfortunately, the Democratic Party is the left most viable party, but I certainly believe in white settler colonialism. You know, many of those people are not, they don't care, they don't realize, maybe they realize exactly what I said. You are just using anti-Zionism as a way to express your anti-Semitism in an analogous way, where if you used a similar expression that clearly conveyed that you were against any other ethnic group, you would be appalled, right? And even things that are more acceptable, like, you know, in sports media, you can't call anyone a thug, which is fair enough because that's coded as a racist slur. The same is absolutely true of anti-Zionism. That's how it's come to play out in American politics and on college campuses.
Yeah, to me, it's remarkably analogous to the word anti-Semitism, right? Because anti-Semitism was invented by this Wilhelm Marr and these other guys to sound scientific and sophisticated rather than the old-fashioned Jew hatred. And you'll still find people to this day, you know, particularly in the sort of the pro-Hamas, super anti-Israel universe, who say, I can't be anti-Semitic, I'm a Semite.
Arafat said that.
Yeah,
right,
and the thing is, it's
famously.
Like, Semites is like a weird linguistic category from philology that doesn't really exist anymore. It was designed at the time to mean we don't like Jews. And that's what it means. But it's another one of these get out of jail free cards by saying, well, I don't hate Jews. I'm just anti-Semitic. Right. And that's where it kind of.
So let me ask you about that. So Raphael Lemkin invents this phrase genocide. He doesn't invent it, but he popularizes it and it applies to specific situations. And I think luckily there are legal codes and there are standards, not just in the ether like anti-Semitism. But don't you think the word genocide, not the legal definition, though the legal definition might might follow, the word genocide is trending towards the direction of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. These phrases that used to have a distinct meaning and can now just mean, anything that we don't like, where certain people are more killed than other people.
Yeah, no, I do. I think it's trending towards essentially just a blood libel charge, right? Because it's being, first of all, the Lemkin stuff. I mean, the Lemkin history is really fascinating, right? And the Soviets fought really, really hard to keep out of the definition of genocide adopted by the UN,
right?
The destroying people because they're a member of a class, because
right.
That's what the Soviets did, right?
Yeah. And this all played out. This all played out in the Nuremberg trials, and it was Justice Jackson who allowed it. I don't know if you read East West Street by Felipe Sands, but it was great on Lemkin, and you should read that on Hirschberg. Two guys who invented the concept of genocide and the concept of crimes against humanity, and they grew up in the same street, a few different years apart in Liev, in what's now Ukraine. Lviv.
I had no idea. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think, if you say you are, really passionate about the genocide in Gaza, and it's not just that you are sort of going with the herd about where the sort of what the correct opinion, the fashionable opinion you're supposed to have, but if you actually get worked up about it, I think it's a tell about what your approach to this stuff is. And I just do not believe at all that it's genocide. And I don't think it logically makes sense that it's genocide. If Israel was committed to genocide, why weren't they doing the genociding prior to October 7th?
Yeah.
Why are they fighting the war the way that they're doing? And you can make the case, I might argue with you about it, but you can make the case that they're being too harsh. They're doing, that their tactics are self-defeating. You can make all sorts of arguments about the settlers. I'm not going to get in the way of any of that stuff. But the idea that they're trying to commit genocide, that they're simultaneously all powerful and they run the world, and yet the entire world is beating up on them, and they're incapable of actually pulling off genocide.
Right.
There's just some inconsistencies in there that need to be disentangled a little bit.
Right. The intentional destruction, in whole or in part, of a people or ethnicity or culture. Intentional, right? If it was intentional, we'd see a lot different picture. The Israeli Defense Forces would not that their deaths have been in a massive proportion, but there wouldn't be hundreds of dead if it was all the intentional destruction. It's a war. And
they wouldn't be dropping leaflets,
casualties,
right? They wouldn't be dropping leaflets telling people get out of the way, or pinging their phones saying get out of here and all that kind of stuff. And
that does cut against it. I mean, I could see a case where all this stuff is just to stay on the good side of world opinion. But I think that when genocide was specifically applied to the Nazis, and you could go through their history, and you didn't find a whole lot of Nazis debating with each other about ways to save the lives of any Jews. This never happened, right? And it didn't happen in Rwanda. And what do we do to save some of the Tutsis? Never happened. In actual cases of genocide, this doesn't happen. And of course it happens in Israel. Also with the Tutsis and with the Hutus and with in Srebrenica, there was never a case where there was one population we wanted a genocide and just a couple miles away another population. And the only military action, or 90-something% of the military action, was only done to this one class of people who lived in a geographic area and were ethnically and religiously indistinguishable from this other class of people. I'm talking about the Arabs of the West Bank or the Arabs of Israel themselves. So we both are, what do you say? We're both in vehement agreement.
That's right. Violent agreement.
Violent agreement.
So
yes.
I want to get on there just simply in part because I know that you've been amongst the protesters in Chicago, and you're high on Italian beef sandwiches and genocide talk. But we should get back to the Democrats.
Or as we Italians call it, just beef sandwiches.
Yeah, and in Brazil, do they just call them nuts?
Yes, but those are filberts. Yes.
So you mentioned the choice of Tim Walz earlier. I increasingly have my problems with Walz. A lot of stuff is coming out. His wife just issued a statement this morning saying, "Oh, by the way, that we actually didn't do IVF," which I think is kind of outrageous. If
so we called her Hope because we hope to do IVF. Where does the Hope name come from?
They did this other intrauterine insemination thing, which which is a thing. It's a fertility treatment, but it's nowhere near the drama and cost and difficulty that IVF is. And you should get that right when you're going around campaigning on it, right? Is my only point. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. My point is, I think the best example of, and you must deal with this all the time, of the disconnect between the very online and the real world can be seen around Tim Walz. Like my friend Eric Erickson the other day tweeted, like, maybe they're going to dump Walz at the convention because he's been such a disaster. You have all these people on Twitter talking about how disastrous he's been and all that kind of stuff. And his personal approval ratings in the polls just keep going up.
Right.
And so it's like this, we live in this world of very, very, very Twitter adjacent, Twitter invested world where everyone we know is agreeing with us. I don't mean you and me. I mean these sort of bubbles. And then you go into the real world and it's a completely different thing. And so I'm just wondering, first of all, what do you think of the Walz pick? And second, like, where do you come down on the very online versus not, dichotomy in our lives?
If Josh Shapiro weren't, to me, a very attractive candidate in a more important state, I'd say Walz was the best choice. Kelly would also be a good choice. I interviewed Walz in 2006. He hadn't even been sworn in yet as a congressman. And I remember thinking, I like this guy more than any member of Congress or potential member of Congress that I ever met before. My parents were teachers. We talked about him being a teacher. Authenticity means nothing. The word is the least authentic thing. But if it does mean something, at least 2006, congressional Tim Walz seems to be what you want from your citizen legislators. And then he becomes governor of the state and he becomes less centrist as a governor. But, to me, that shows decent enough politics. Steve Kornacki will make this point that electorally, he's actually not good, no better at going to the red sections of his state and convincing them that he's an acceptable choice. But, watch him or listen to him for 5 minutes. He's a capable speaker. He's a funny guy. You can't say he's not an affable presence. I think the stuff about him being command sergeant major or whatever his last rank was, I don't know. I talked to a veteran yesterday and he said all the veterans he knows, and I stopped him and say, do you only talk to Democratic veterans? He's like, I'm a IBEW worker in Iowa. I almost only talk to conservative veterans, and they know, the more they know about the military, more they know that the criticism of him is not apt. Even though it's certainly true that he said, I carry guns in war. I really do think he misspoke that one time. So long answer short, I think it's a good choice. I think it's not the optimal choice. I don't see the slings and arrows against him as landing. I just don't see that. I tell you, like with Kamala Harris, I think many of the criticisms are really apt. What's the biggest criticism with Walz is, I think for 24 hours, he did not address the riots in Minneapolis sufficiently. That is true. He could have given them assistance earlier. I don't know if it would have saved the 3rd precinct. But other than that, for the Democratic Party today and what they want to represent, I think it's a really good choice. That, as vice president, won't matter that much. Why? What do you think?
No, I'm sort of on the same page. I was doing CNN during the Republican convention, or whatever. I was on CNN the morning after the Walz pick. That was in DC, and I was like, I was sort of bought into the idea that he was a bad pick, that she should have picked Shapiro. And then I saw that rollout and I was like, every time I deviate from and I hate the word at this point, but I still use it, my vibes analysis.
Yeah.
I get proven wrong, right? So like, I don't think issues matter. I think they should matter. They don't matter, right? All sorts of things should matter. That's why I can't have nice things. But like, it's going to boil down to vibes. Biden had worse vibes than Trump. Trump has worse vibes than Kamala. That's why I think Kamala's probably going to win. That could change, but who knows? But I said on CNN, I was like, look, I'm changing my mind. I think he might be the right pick, with the one caveat that if Kamala Harris loses Pennsylvania, this was obviously a disastrous pick.
Yeah, if she loses by 0.5 or less, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, like, everybody I know who knows about governors and tickets and all that kind of stuff. Like senators from, like if he was a senator from Pennsylvania, I don't think it would have mattered at all, right?
Right.
But
unless it was Fetterman.
Yeah, well, that had an impact.
Yeah.
But governors, when it's a really tight race, just because they have control of the resources and the parks and rec people and all that kind of stuff, they're good for like a half point to point bump.
Yeah, that's what Nate Silver, he ran like 20,000 regressions and said in about 1,000 cases it would make a difference. Not that Shapiro, I mean, not that he only matters in 1,000 out of 20,000, but it was close enough so that the amount he mattered, which was in Nate's analysis, 0.4%. I'd take 0.4%. 0.4% of a few million votes is, tens of thousands of votes.
Yeah. But he's going to be more of a lightning rod for the right than I thought they thought he was going to be. I mean, this is one of these. I agree with you. I think he said some things about his military service that are worthy of criticism. But I don't think the stolen valor line attack, I think, is kind of BS.
Yeah.
But I don't blame people in his unit for being pissed that this guy they relied on decided to like pull out, to leave right before, what they see as before deployment. What the full story there is, I don't know. But if all that's true, I understand why I would be pissed about that. On the other time, who am I to gainsay someone who spent 2 decades, in the National Guard?
That's what I say. He's allowed. If we didn't know him, I did this analysis. Somewhere there's a universe where Tim Walz is a public school teacher, and he has a bright young kid named J.D. Vance. And he loves J.D. Vance because J.D. Vance is smart, and he came from humble circumstance, and then J.D. Vance joins the Marines, and Tim Walz, maybe in this alternate universe, Tim Walz, even though they're in different branches, would have been his commander. Those two guys would love each other. Mm-hmm. They'd vibe. They'd see in themselves a little bit of each other, I do think. I don't think that – I very much agree with you. I think that – for those of us who weren't in the military, command sergeant major is such a respected position. And no one that I have heard of who really understands it says that he was really trying to claim that he was a rank that he never earned. He did earn that rank. He didn't retire as that rank. And the other thing is, how can you say someone who has served decades and achieved so much and has universal acclaim from those he served with, he's never allowed to get out? And if he does get out, he gets out to do the shameful thing of run for Congress in a long shot bid? That's called public service. So I think you add it all up. I don't see why anyone who would otherwise be predisposed to vote for Walz wouldn't. Then again, I wouldn't have thought the Swift boating attacks would work, and they seem to have.
Yeah. I'm more, I'll be honest, I'm more sympathetic to the Swift boat stuff than I am to the Walz stuff.
Because how Kerry comes across, right?
Well, one, he's a human toothache, right? but two, because he made, and this sort of gets to the point, right? It's like he made his military service the central rationale for his candidacy in 2004. John Kerry,
for duty.
Right. And you can't throw your medals over the fence and say that your comrades in arms were war criminals and then say, oh, but by the way, I'm super proud for my military service and all that, right?
But wasn't Swift boating not that? That's an apt critique. Swift boating was, he only had rice-sized wounds.
Yeah, look, I just had this conversation with Chris Sarawalt trying to get to the bottom of what the separating the wheat from the chaff was on the Swift boat stuff. I still need to go back and revisit it. This is one of these things where in the Trump era, I have to, was I wrong about that? And I went back and I think I was still right about Benghazi.
Yeah.
But it depends on what people mean by Swift boat. I'm open to the idea that maybe some of that was wrong.
I did a week on my show called I Was Wrong. And I did just that. That would be a good week or whatever. The I Was Wrong edition. And you'll be happy to hear maybe that mostly I was wrong by taking, if not a knee jerk, I thought considered position to the left. And it turns out that the more conservative explanation was the better one.
So what were the things you were wrong about?
I came down pretty hard on Aziz Ansari for his quote bad date, and looking back on that, I didn't think he raped anyone. Do you remember which I'm talking about?
I mean, vaguely, but yeah.
Yeah. It was one of those threshold Me Too that is now seen as an excess of accusing someone who just had a bad date. And I pretty much think now that that's the explanation. I was wrong. Sometimes I'm wrong about how willingly will reabsorb people into a good standing. Like I thought Louis C.K. would do a little bit of an apology and then his genius as a comedian would be excused. Now, I was wrong about that. I'm not saying he doesn't have a career. He probably chose not to have a career, and people will say, oh, he was nominated for Grammy. He's never been on Colbert again. He's never been on Jimmy Kimmel again. He's never done a network TV show again. So it's wrong about the amount of forgiveness our society would show Louis C.K. I'll think about some of the other I was wrongs.
So I'll give you a couple I was wrongs. I always thought that the birtherism stuff was kind of stupid, but also not very important. And I've made that mistake quite a few times in my life, where I think that because something makes so little sense or is so obviously being overhyped, that therefore it doesn't matter. And I was wrong about that. Like, yeah, it was racist, which I was always open to, but I just didn't. I underestimated its significance in significant ways. I probably, by extension, underestimated the component of race stuff with opposition to Obama. Obviously, I always recognized that it was there, but like grading portions is where you make these mistakes, and I probably underestimated some of that. I'm trying to think.
I'll give you a couple more that I was wrong about. I was wrong that Aaron Rupar would continue to have a career during the Biden administration. He somehow does. People love his clips, right? I was wrong about, in general, and this is a huge one that greatly affected my life. I was wrong about the excesses on college campuses or the social movements, what we've called woke. I was absolutely one of those people who said, college students have always been excessive, and all these stories that that Breitbart's surfacing, they're not typical until and then I also retreated to and once these people get to the American workplace, they won't be able to indulge and engage in that. It was totally wrong. It was much deeper, bigger, and I think people, to go back to our original conversation, the guardians of the institutions were much less, I'm not even going to say brave, I would say operating in their enlightened self-interest than they thought they would be, right? I mean, they kowtowed to so many of these, they kowtowed to the Mau-Mauing, and it didn't, serve them, but that is what happened. I'll tell you, I was also wrong. This is not something I beat myself up about, but on my show, I don't name the shooter. I saw some compelling evidence about how driven by fame they are. And, a lot of places, right and left, don't essentially name the shooter. I'm a First Amendment guy. On first reference, I probably will. But then I will generally say, the Columbine shooter, the Paducah shooter, whatever, no names. It has had no effect. We have to admit it has had no effect. Many people have not been naming the shooter, and there have been more and more shooters. I was right about, and I called this early, Madison Cawthorn has no political skills. This guy is going to lose re-election. I was right about the Alec Baldwin trial, maybe for the wrong reasons. I don't know if he got off on a technicality, but I thought there was no chance that this guy was going to get convicted. And I was right about Trump being able to post a bond, a surety bond. There is this whole garden industry of claiming that Trump has no money. Like, as frustrating as it may be to you, Trump hater, he's got money. He's going to produce the bond. So I got some right and wrong.
So let me go back to, you're supposed to be on here as this, this hot correspondent from the bowels of the Democratic Convention, and we keep going on these other things. So let me ask you this. Do you think, let's put it this way, do you think Kamala Harris has reached the point of diminishing returns and not talking to the media and not giving a serious interview? Or do you think that she still has gas in the tank of this strategy?
There's no sign that it's not working. No one outside the media seems upset. And also, after the convention, so she's busy with the convention, and then she'll ride on that a little bit. She'll do 2 interviews and some version of a press conference where she calls on the people she wants and she dictates how much time there is, and that'll be that. I think it's sad, but yes, I don't. Okay. So the short answer is she could milk it for a little more and then do some de minimis press engagement and be fine. Sadly enough.
And do you think that she will, in fact, do well in her first interview?
Yes, I do. Because, you know, the Kamala Harris we're seeing now is different from the one who sat down with Lester Holt. Even though she hasn't done many interviews, I think that the Kamala Harris who ran in 2020 was running against who she really was, because she, like everyone else in the Democratic field, misread the moment. And maybe her sister was advising her to be more leftward seeming than she was. And she had no confidence in her answers. And just, you know, another factor is, when you're a district attorney and attorney general and senator, you think, oh, okay, they've gone through the political mill. Not really. You know, the position she was elected for as district attorney had specific questions. Same with attorney general. She had no real race for senator. So someone else would have been asked certain questions that could have put them in a tough position hundreds of times. Bernie Sanders has gotten every potential, well, I don't know the answer to that, hundreds of times. Plus, Bernie knows himself and he's ideologically consistent. Kamala has to think about this every single time on the fly. So she's going to make mistakes. As vice president, either questions asked or unasked, she has played that out. She kind of knows the answers now. She's not going to be asked, should violent felons get the vote? She's not going to be, I don't know what to say. She's going to say, no, they should not. And that'll be that. And so what are the things she's going to step in, you know? I even think we saw that with the price rollouts. She or her team the price control. It was all set to be pretty aggressive. I don't know how they would have actually gotten price controls, but she was going to name all these programs. And then she got so much blowback that the actual speech was much less than the most aggressive version of that. So I've gone from thinking she's a person without great political instincts. She has great rhetorical instincts and she's smart. I do think she's smart. I maybe think it wasn't that she didn't have great political instinct. She didn't have the reps. She was like this brilliant or pretty good, high drafted rookie second year quarterback. And she would just throw into coverage. Now it's not that she's changed. She's just seen things a little more and is much less likely to cause herself answers that'll torpedo herself.
So it's funny. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with all that, but that's defensible. But it kind of reminds me, one of the oldest pieces of advice in Washington is that if you did nothing wrong, don't lie to anybody. Because first of all, you get screwed on the charge for perjury or whatever, right? But also, if you only stick to what you actually know is the truth, you don't have to remember anything weird, right? You don't have to remember the stuff that, oh, I'm supposed to say this to this guy and all that kind of thing. And I got that advice early on in like the Lewinsky stuff. And I just I'll just tell the truth. And I've sort of stuck with that ever since. I think it's a really good policy.
It helps. It helps if the truth puts you in good stead, right?
Yeah.
You might have had to lie if you were a different kind of person.
For sure. But like, also with like the Dominion lawsuit, I got subpoenaed for that. And that was a huge pain in the ass. And I just don't lie. And I think that there's an analog to that in politics, which is that if you don't know what you're for political reasons, you don't know what your position is or should be, you are constantly getting yourself into trouble. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of what got her into trouble in 2019. And I keep trying to explain to my right-wing friends, look, I don't want either of these guys to be president of the United States, but this is the world we've chosen. But her flip-flopping is good, right? If she's flip-flopping from crazy left-wing positions to more positions that the median voter holds, we should celebrate it. Even if it's bad for Republicans, if you're a conservative first and Republican second, you want politicians to flip-flop to your positions or closer to your positions, right? And the fact that she's flip-flopping is evidence that she's not the ideological extremist people say she is, because Bernie Sanders doesn't flip-flop like that. I mean, he's flip-flopping on a couple little things like immigration stuff, but like he's actually the social democrat he claims to be, so he doesn't, right? And the fact that she's willing to flip-flop on this stuff shows that maybe the 2019 one was fake too, and that we're finding out what the real one is. I don't agree with you, though, that she will... I would not bet on her acing her first major interview. I think... I remember watching her closely in 2019, and I think I even wrote about it at one point. I thought it was hilarious. I saw her in like 3 separate interviews where she was asked, because she wrote this book about like American unity and unified hopefulness for unity and all that crap. And she kept getting asked, I said, what are the things that, unite Americans? And she says, the things that unite us are stronger than the things that divide us. We all worry about, will I be able to retire? We all worry about eating food, right? And she started just to describe things that were basic requirements for carbon-based life forms, rather than like anything having to do with being an American or having anything like, tangible.
She went deep into Maslow instead of Madison. Yeah,
exactly. That's a good way of putting it. And like, she should have had better answers then. And, and I think, but on a strategic level, it just feels to me like if she doesn't give a big interview soon, the pressure for that first interview is going to be ginormous, right? Just raising the stakes because everyone, this is the first one. I would be giving like softball-y kind of interviews to local newscasters to get people a little bored with watching her be interviewed, rather than like first rollout before early voting is on 60 Minutes, where even 60 Minutes will probably take the temptation to ask hard questions.
Right. So maybe it's why do a big one? Say yes to all the networks at once. Maybe not in the same day, but pretty much, right? And spread it out. Now, if you were interviewing her, give me 2 questions that you think we deserve answers to and that she would struggle with.
Oh, that's a good question. Hey, wait a second. This is my podcast. What are the 2 questions that you would ask? And then I'll give you mine.
I would definitely ask her about immigration and if she thinks that some of these, can we get immigration right if we're simply kinder to immigrants seeking asylum? That seems to be what the Democrats were prescribing all along. Now, I know she'll default to her answers, but she is trailing Trump on immigration, and he does propose very strong immigration laws. So why are his laws wrong? Is it just a question of kindness?
That's good. Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of ones with the immigration stuff, which I think are totally legitimate. And like on policy stuff, I mean, I would want to grill her about the price control things because I really do think it's profoundly stupid. But if I wanted to, I'm torn about this because on the one hand, I don't think it's the scandal that people want to make it. On the other hand, I do want to know the answer. It's like, what did you know about Joe Biden's condition and how long did you know it, right?
That's right.
Because she's the vice president of the United States. She had a weekly lunch with this guy. And yet up until the post-debate thing, she was insisting that this guy's as sharp as a tack.
Right. This is a great question. 3, you pull out a direct quote. Joe Biden is as sharp as an individual as I've ever met, the whole behind closed doors stuff where it's her words. And then you say to her, did you just lie or did you totally misperceive the actual condition in which Joe Biden himself admitted? And then you give a quote to her. And I understand the third part, this is just between me or you, which is she knew that Joe Biden was bad and had to go, but she also was going to do that privately rather than publicly. I don't know. Maybe in your question, you acknowledge that that's a possibility. But yeah. And you could also do the thing where you anticipate the answer. Now, I know you're going to say that he was heroic and he served our country, and we understand that. And I'll give you time to say that after you specifically answer, did you not know his condition or did you know? And we're not being totally honest with the American people. I think there's a good answer to that question, which is something I just said. I did have inclinations, but I was not in a position to publicly push him out. As a politician, as a trusted advisor, there are better ways to do this. And, there are people's feelings, legacies, political legacies involved. And so, yeah, just because I'm not blasting the guy in public doesn't mean that we didn't know we had to do something in private. I don't know. I'd respect that answer.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that this moment really does remind you is how Bill Clinton was really, really good and could come up with 10, it's like dealing with ChatGPT when you get an answer you don't like from it. Give me a different version of that answer. And like, Bill Clinton could do it, right? And I don't think Kamala has anything like Bill's chops, and that's not really that big a dig on her because so few politicians in my lifetime could do what Bill Clinton could do. All right, so let me ask you this: we're almost out of time. Last night was Joe Biden's swan song. I should say this morning was his swan song because the convention went so late. That he actually spoke, or he actually finished at least on the second day of the convention rather than the first. And I think And so, well, a bunch of rapid fire questions. First of all, do you think it was deliberate? Do you think that they wanted to get him out of prime time? Maybe not because they thought he would be bad, because they thought the risk of him being bad wasn't worth it, and so pushing him past prime time? Or do you just think it was a screw up? Or do you take them at their word that they say it was because there was so much extra applause than there normally is that we had to bump James Taylor?
Never.
What is your explanation of it?
Yeah, in this one, it's never a tribute to conspiracy what incompetence would explain. So the Democrats are not running a tight ship so far. I would say that.
Yeah.
I have seen fire. And also, we've all seen fire and we've all seen rain. I mean, come on. We know what's going on.
In fairness, and someone else made this point already, but like in fairness, running a convention is really hard. It's not easy, like setting the price for bacon and eggs for the entire friggin' country. That's not complicated. All right. Then there's the question. There are many people, some who are just saying it because they feel like they need to say it. Like I saw Jamie Harrison tweeted last night, head of the DNC, that Joe Biden was not one of, the most consequential president in American history.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big FDR fan. I kind of like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. I don't think that's a defensible claim on the merits. If you disagree, I would love to hear it, but instead, let's just move on.
Do I disagree? I'm going to put up the Depression and World War II against the Build Back Better Act? No.
Do you think that Joe Biden's departure from the ticket is best described as an act of selfless patriotism, or the last gasp of someone who was essentially defenestrated in, I don't like the word coup for this stuff, but who was cruelly defenestrated, and it was a man with no other options?
If you're crawling towards the window and you open the window and you take off the child guard, were you really defenestrated? If you're poking your head out. Yeah, I think that I don't think it was a selfless act, right? I think it was a selfish patriotic act. I think he was preserving his legacy and allowing Jamie Harrison to make inept comparisons to almost every other president. I think he might be one of the least consequential, by the way, except for the fact that, America is so much more important now. And, Abraham Lincoln didn't even have a Justice Department. But seriously, Chester A. Arthur was a more consequential president. The before or after, and also the alternative, I think I would say Chester A. Arthur. I would say all of our first 7 presidents were more important. I mean, when you're dealing with a startup company like that, every other slip up could really screw you over. So no, there is the case for, you could say good. Consequential is almost precisely the wrong word for Joe Biden. Yeah.
Right. And you could do, which I don't think is what he was intending. You could say things would be so. It is a defensible claim, defensible point of view that things would be so bad if Trump were president.
Yeah,
that deciding not to run so that Harris could run to beat Trump, that is a very consequential thing. Still, I don't think it stands up to like Abraham Lincoln winning the Civil War.
Right. I would say that the defeat of Donald Trump, the delta between those two and what those two represented, that's in the conversation for most consequential, I do think.
Top 10.
Right.
20.
Because even if Adams loses to Jackson, and then we run it back the other way, we got both of them. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
But that's me trying to do cleanup work for the DNC, which I'm so famous for doing all the time. All right. Last and among the dumbest pundit questions, but when you do as much cable as I do, they got to fill the time somehow. What are you looking for in this convention? What is something that you're keeping an eye out for that will make it possible for you to do some thumb-sucking punditry about trends or predictions?
From purely selfish reasons, I would like some new arguments, some new facts to emerge, a new, something that I hadn't thought of before, even if it's a new framing for an issue. So far, I haven't gotten that. The potentially most interesting thing was, who's the Michigan legislator? Mallory. I can't remember her name, but she came up and started talking about Project 2025 in this huge bound version from one of the maesters from Game of Thrones pulled it down. That's interesting. That was an interesting choice. So I would like to see something interesting from this convention. And I also think this is true. We don't talk about it now, but all those pieces about how, as a brand, Democrat was dead to a large portion of the country, white working class. It was just a dead brand. Are you going to show me something beside the person of Tim Walz that says Democrat is a vibrant brand, a brand that is has some staying power? In the Republican convention, the union head, at least doing the toe touch of trying to get the Republicans to back him. And the Republicans, every time he said working class people, they cheered. Every time he said union, they did not. But that was interesting. I saw some movement among the Republicans trying to get a new constituency. I'd like to see what the Democrats are doing to try to say, you know, we're of the working class. I think mostly it's in what they're not saying and emphasizing. They're not de-emphasizing it, but it's not a huge emphasis on identitarianism. I'd like to see what they do if there's a night with, you know, 4 working class white guys in a row saying Kamala's my gal.
Yeah. I think the silences are often more interesting than the...
Right, like abortion with the RNC, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, RNC, there was no talk about the stolen election. There was no talk about January 6th. You know, you didn't get the January 6th choir performing or any of that kind of stuff. And then this, no shock they're talking about abortion, but like the transgender stuff, there have been some mentions of it, but like certainly no defund the police, no. Right.
So they're not going to say defund the police, but even as an issue, police reform, or look at last conventions and how Hillary Clinton would brag about, I was the first to institute implicit bias training. You're not getting any of those types of claims.
Yeah.
By the way, it strikes me that you and I are constitutionally ill-suited to rapid fire rounds.
I think that's correct. And with that, Mike Pesca, I hope you come back. This is fun.
I had a great time. My podcast is The Gist. It's the longest running podcast around.
I was going to mention all that.
Oh,
in
thanks,
the close,
Jonah.
But you know, you know, if you want to do it yourself, you know, what does it say in the Talmud? If I am not for myself, who will be? So there you go.
Thank you, Rebbe.